Welcome back to Chapter 7. This chapter is on vital harvest, deriving energy from food. And this section will look at energizing ATP, the 3 stages of cellular respiration. We'll go over each of those 3 stages, which are glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, and then talk about how other foods go through other respiratory pathways. First off, your chapter begins with a discussion of climbers dying while climbing Mount Everest, in part due to lack of oxygen. And at the top of Mount Everest, the amount of oxygen is about one-third the amount present at sea level. And we all know that oxygen is essential to life on Earth. You know that you need to breathe oxygen, but in this chapter, we'll discuss why that is that your body so critically needs oxygen. So the short answer to why we need oxygen is that ATP is the molecule that our bodies constantly use for energy. And making ATP from ADP, which we talked about in the last chapter, requires oxygen. There's a lot more to it than that, and in the rest of this chapter, we'll go through all of those steps of how that process of making ATP and using oxygen happens. So the reaction where ATP is made from ADP, and again, ATP has one extra phosphate added onto it, it's sort of that bundle of energy. And that process to make ATP takes energy. The energy transfer isn't just a simple transfer of eat the food and boom, energy is made. There are a lot of steps that need to be taken to transform the food that you eat into energy. In the case of glucose, which is one of the common things that you put into your body and various foods you eat, electrons contained within the glucose get channeled off slowly in order to give the energy needed to add a phosphate onto ADP to make ATP. And so we're going to go through all those steps of how that happens. The whole process of turning glucose in the glucose that you eat into ATP energy that can be used by all of your cells. This process uses electrons as the energy source. And when a substance loses an electron, we say it's undergone oxidation. So if you've heard the term something's been oxidized, like it's rusted, that's what happens when it's exposed, can be exposed to oxygen and loses an electron. So when you hear that term oxidized or oxidation, that means an electron has been lost from a substance. When a substance gains an electron, we say it's undergone reduction. Now, this seems kind of weird to say that it's gained electrons and it's undergone reduction. But the reason why we use the term reduction is because it's had a reduction in charge. So when you gain an electron, you become more negative and your overall charge gets lower. Since electrons are negative. So usually in a reaction, one substance will get oxidized, one substance will lose an electron, and another substance will gain that electron and become reduced. And we call this combination of one substance losing an electron and the other substance gaining it, we call it a reduction oxidation or just simply a redox reaction. The reason that we care about redox reactions is that turning glucose into ATP takes energy, and that energy comes from electrons, and those electrons are moved from one place to another from where they need to go to fuel this process through redox reactions. Let's look here at an overview of how that glucose is going to get transformed into ATP energy. So the first thing that's going to happen is you eat something, some kind of plant product with glucose in it, and that glucose starts getting broken down. During each step of the process, in each phase, a little bit of ATP tends to be given off initially, but the main things that happens in these first phases, and this is just showing glucose getting broken down from one thing into another thing into another thing, but in each step where glucose gets broken down a little more, something called NADH is given off, and this is just an electron carrier. So it's this molecule that's carrying electrons, and we'll go over this in the next slide, but we call it NAD plus when it doesn't have an extra electron, and NADH when it's filled with an electron and carrying it off to another phase. So glucose starts getting broken down. This NADH here carries the energy to further down in the process, where it's finally all of these electrons here that are being carried around go into something called the electron transport chain, where a lot of ATP is given off. So this is just an overview. We're going to go over all of these steps and what happens in each of these steps in the next coming up slides. But if you'll notice in this process, one of the final things that is needed in this process in order to make that ATP energy is oxygen. And that's why oxygen is so essential to constantly breathe in, because your body cannot make any of the energy it needs without that oxygen. And so when you stop breathing in the necessary oxygen, your body can't make energy and can't fuel any of the other processes going on within your body. Okay, so one of the most important electron carriers is called NAD, which stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, and you can just remember NAD. And it exists in two states. So when it is empty and there's no extra electron, we call it NAD+. Your book mentions that you can think of it like an empty taxi cab. It is not carrying any passengers, and the passengers being electrons. When the NAD gets an extra electron, so it's carrying an electron with that molecule, then we call it NADH, and that's like your taxi cab having passengers inside of it. And again, the passenger is an electron, and just as a reminder, electrons are the energy source that's needed to fuel this whole process of turning your food into usable energy. And remember, all of this is considered a redox reaction because the NAD takes electrons in when it becomes NADH. And so that moving of electrons from not having electrons to gaining electrons, that's all part of a redox reaction. So we're going to start going through in the next few slides this whole process here of how glucose gets broken down and turned into ATP. But just so you understand the symbols as we're going through this, when you see this yellow box with NADH, that's indicating an electron carrier, an energy carrier. And that is something that's moving electrons from one phase to another. It's not usable energy for your cell in a sense of actually fueling different cellular processes, but it is something that's just carrying energy from one place to another. What your body ultimately wants for energy is ATP. That's the usable energy, and that's what's going to come out of this whole process. So whenever you see ATP coming off here, that's indicating that usable energy has been created that will go out into your body and help fuel all of the processes in your body. Let's do a quick review here. If a substance that loses one or more electrons to another is said to have undergone what? While the substance that received the electrons in this reaction has undergone this, and the entire coupled reaction is called a what reaction? So a substance that loses one or more electrons to another is said to have undergone oxidation, while the substance that received the electrons in this reaction has undergone reduction. So and you're going to keep seeing these terms pop up, that's why I'm trying to kind of hammer these in a little bit, but the substance that loses electrons has undergone oxidation. So oxidation is when electrons are lost. Reduction is when electrons are gained. And this entire process of electrons moving from one thing to another is called a redox reaction. So let's look first at an overview of cellular respiration. So there's 3 different stages that we'll talk about in our lecture today and that your textbook talks about. And again, cellular respiration is just harvesting of energy from the food that you eat. So it's taking in something such as glucose, turning it into energy. And there's 3 stages. The first stage, the blue here, is glycolysis. And in this stage here, 2 ATP are produced and a little bit of a couple of electron carriers are produced. Now, some animals will just do glycolysis as their main form of energy, but most all living things will go through all of these 3 stages. And I just mentioned that because your book mentions it. Some animals do stop here, but almost everything that we'll come across goes through all 3 stages. So a little bit of ATP is produced here in glycolysis, not very much. Next, we have the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, which produces 2 more ATP and some more electron carriers. And all of this ATP and electrons and the products that are broken down from that glucose goes into something called the electron transport chain, and that process will produce 32 ATP. So the main energy source here is in that final stage, the electron transport chain, but you need those initial two stages to get the products necessary to go into the final step to get all that energy out at the end. Now we're going to go through each of those stages: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain in a little bit more detail. So first stage of respiration is called glycolysis, and the only thing going into glycolysis is glucose. So one molecule of glucose will get broken down into a little bit of energy, so 2 ATP, 2 NADH electron or energy carriers, and 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid. This is sort of what's left over after you take this energy out, and that pyruvate will be used to fuel the next stage of the process. So glucose gets, again, broken down a little bit. What's left over is called pyruvic acid. The pyruvic acid combines with an enzyme to form the substance called acetyl-CoA. Not so important that you know this term, but just know that this glucose is getting broken down a little bit, combines with an enzyme, produces something else, and that acetyl-CoA is what's going to go into our next phase called the Krebs or the citric acid cycle. Also given off during this phase that we're in right here is some carbon dioxide and some more NADH or energy carriers. Now, if you notice here that carbon dioxide is given off, that comes out when you breathe. So when you breathe out, that carbon dioxide that's produced in this process here comes out in your breath. So you breathe out carbon dioxide, you're kind of getting rid of that as a waste product after this reaction has taken place. And so we now have our acetyl-CoA and some more electron NADH carriers that have been given off, and those are going to go into our next step of our cycle. And this next step, the second stage of respiration, is called the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And so remember, we have acetyl-CoA that's been produced so far, right here. The acetyl-CoA goes into this cycle and gets oxidized, which means it loses an electron. So that electron's given off as a couple different electron carriers. The NADH that you've heard of, and then FADH, which is similar to NADH. It's just another molecule carrying an electron for energy to be used later. And this Krebs cycle also gives off 2 ATP, so 2 bits of usable energy, some energy carriers, and those things are all going to go into the next stage of our cycle. So final stage of our cycle, stage 3, is the electron transport chain. And it's a pathway where all the NADH and FADH, those electron carriers that have been used so far, all those get used to make a whopping total of 32 ATP. So the final step in turning all of these products into usable ATP occurs in an organelle in your cell called the mitochondria. And this final process is called the electron transport chain. And once all of the energy, this electron energy that's been carried by NADH and FADH, once it gets to this phase, it gets oxidized, meaning it gives off those electrons, so that energy can now be used. And what it's used for is to push hydrogen ions from one side of the membrane and inside the mitochondria to the other. So these hydrogen ions get pumped across the membrane. That takes a lot of energy. And again, that energy comes from all of the NADH and FADH that's been produced in the cycle. So we pump hydrogen ions across here. You could think of it sort of like pushing water up a hill. It's going to take a lot of energy, but once you've pushed all this water up the hill, it's going to then naturally, just by force, like water would want to flow down a hill, flow back through something called ATP synthase. And so as it flows through this ATP synthase, it's somewhat like putting water through a windmill. So water is flowing down the hill, it's turning this windmill, and as this windmill turns, that's giving that energy to take ADP and add a phosphate onto it. So we take ADP, we add a phosphate onto it, and we get ATP. So this process happens over and over and over again, that hydrogen ions get pumped across. They flow sort of downhill, turning that windmill and creating the energy to turn ADP into ATP. And this happens, this ADP to ATP happens a total of 32 different times, creating 30 molecules of ATP. Now, in this cycle, oxygen is needed to accept these electrons that get given off. And so as these electrons initially here are given off from the NADH and the FADH, oxygen is needed to accept those electrons. And when you get oxygen mixed with hydrogen, you may be familiar with H2O, water. So oxygen combines with these hydrogens and forms water. And we have to have this oxygen present to accept these electrons. Otherwise, this process can't take place. So if you don't have oxygen present, like the guy climbing Mount Everest did not have enough oxygen present, he was not able to do this final step of the electron transport chain, and therefore could not get the ATP that his body needed to drive all of the other processes going on inside his body. Those are all the phases of cellular respiration, so how glucose gets turned into usable energy by your body. Let's do a quick review here of what's going on in that process. So the diagram on the left and the right are similar. One's just showing more details of what's going on, and one's sort of putting it like a token machine. But our first step here is glucose goes in. It goes through a process called glycolysis, where 2 bits of energy, or ATP, are given off, and then some electron carriers are given off. Those products from glycolysis then go through the Krebs cycle, where some more electrons, energy carriers, are given off, and 2 more bits of ATP energy are given off. The products from the Krebs cycle are then used to fuel the electron transport chain, where slowly, little bits of ADP are transformed into ATP. And so you get 32 bits of energy from that final process. So this is an overview. If you can try to remember as you're going through each of these phases what the main function of each of these phases is, to either produce usable ATP, so usable ATP for your body to use is produced in each of these stages. And then really these first 2 stages produce the energy carriers, the electrons needed to fuel this final electron transport chain, which is going to produce a lot of usable energy for your body. Overall, there are 36 ATP glucose molecules, 36 ATP molecules produced for every 1 glucose molecule that goes into your body. And we get that 36 from 32 plus 2 plus 2. Now, different nutrients and their derivatives can be channeled through different pathways. So we've gone through what happens with glycolysis, or with glucose. We're not going to go through what happens with every other type of food that you could eat. But certain proteins and fats will actually come into play and help run the various stages that we've talked about. So your carbohydrates include that glucose that initially goes in that you need, but also amino acids from proteins and broken down parts of fats that you eat are also essential to running this whole process. And that's the end of chapter 7. Next week we will be covering chapter 8, and that will be our last chapter for this term.